Hello, my name is Patrick Hein. I will give today's lecture about the Japanese economy. And I would like to mention that I give this lecture to the students of the Armenian State University of Economics, and that the organizer is Dr. Anna Vardanyan, president of Armenia Nippon Scientific and Cultural Union, NGO. So let's start the lecture in a few minutes. Goodbye. Enjoy the lecture. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to meet you today and to give this lecture to you today, to the students of Yerevan State Economic University. So my name is Patrick Hein, and I teach politics, international law, and also German to Japanese university students. I teach at several universities in Japan, and I have been living in Japan for about 25 years. Before I became a teacher, university teacher, I worked in a Japanese company, so I know also from my own experience about life in Japan. So today is a recorded lecture, so we cannot have an interactive Q&A session, but I will try to be as concise as possible about the topic. I hope also that you can follow my English, that it is easy to understand. Okay, maybe you know that Japan is the third largest economy in the world. So maybe you have an image of Japan as a very rich country and also with a high level of technology, educated people. Maybe you have some other images of Japan. Also maybe the samurai, a country that was never invaded by other nations, that always stayed independent, and a country which has a very old culture, more than 2,000 years of history, and also a country which has one ethnic group and one language, which is very homogeneous. So as you know, Japan is an island country, so with 120 million people, so it's also by itself already a big market, even though it's an island. You know, Japan, before it was defeated in 1945, and before the atomic bombings, Japan also had occupied almost all of Asia. And because, as you know, in Japan, the military was ruling the country, and the military was interested in exploiting Asia for economic reasons. So they called it co-prosperity zone in Asia. At that time, Japan was very poor, and it could not feed its people. I mean, during the war, but also after the war, it was poor. It could not feed its people, and they had to, import all the raw materials. Even the rice was imported to Japan. Japan had a population boom, and it was economically, it was like Russia today. It was a war economy. So the whole people was, trying to, work towards military victory. The whole economy was built on the needs of the military, was made for the needs of the military victory. As you know from history, Japan lost the war, and that was a very defining moment because Japan is different from Germany. In Germany, Germany was also, also lost the war, but in Germany, you have a different development after the war compared to Japan. It's not the topic of today's lecture, but I want you to draw your attention to this point. Japan, the shame culture, the guilt culture, maybe you know this debate, Ruth Benedict. I don't believe in this, in this theory. I think also that Japanese people know what guilt is, and German people know what shame is, or Western people. But they use this theory to to forget about their war guilt, the Japanese. If you don't know, if you say, I don't know what guilt is, yeah, then you don't feel sorry for your mistakes and you don't need to show repentance. That was a little bit the case in Japan. Japanese people tried to forget about the war, about their war crimes, and they invested all their energy into rebuilding Japan. It was similar in Germany, but Germany, it was a little bit more guilt. There was a little bit more. There were some, there was some efforts to to become aware of one's own guilt in Germany, I would say. In Japan, this was not the case. The whole, after the war, the Japanese forget about everything, what they had done. They, because also of the atomic bombings, they saw themselves as victims of the war, not as perpetrators. This is a big difference to Germany. And then they invested all their energy into rebuilding the country. It's very important to know that Japanese people, when they rebuilt Japan, they did it not for themselves, not to earn money, not for their family. They did it for Japan because they had lost the war and they wanted to rebuild Japan. And that was a very important motivator. I can tell you about my father-in-law who worked for Hitachi, and he was, he died already, but he was also a top engineer, and he was never at home. He was never with his family. He was always working. Always he was in Japan, but also outside Japan. He worked in Saudi Arabia. He worked in India. He worked in Taiwan. He worked everywhere in China to rebuild Japan. And he did it not for his family, not for himself. He did it for Japan. And there's an interesting series on NHK, if you have time to watch this. It's called Project X. And it shows you, the intensity and also the dangers of rebuilding Japan after the war. Maybe I can show you some statistics here. Here you see the number of industrial accidents in Japan, and you can see before the Tokyo Olympics, the number was already very high. So the peak of the Japanese economic miracle is in the 1960s. The Shinkansen, the Japanese train was built, then the fast train, and also Japan organized the Tokyo Olympics in 1964 for the first time. And when you see here the number of work accidents, it's quite scary, it's quite frightening. Almost 7,000 people died in 1 year because of work-related accidents. Fortunately, the fatalities or the work accidents went down, and now it's like it's it's about normal. It's not normal, but still it's a high number. But compared to the peak in 1960s, it's very low today. And when you watch this Project X, you will see, the work culture of Japan. You know, the philosopher Max Weber, he said that because that capitalism was developed in Western country because of the Protestant work ethics. So people would not spend their money because they want to save money and they want to invest it. So not spending money. That was his theory. But in Japan, we have the same. Even though the Japanese people are not Protestant, they have a similar ethic, like the one described by Max Weber in his books. So the Japanese also, they sacrifice their lives for the country and for the company also where they worked. Now, my father, as I told you, my father-in-law worked for Hitachi, and that was not his physical family, but it was a kind of his home, his home. It was his first home, I would say. So it doesn't mean that he was also, of course, he was a father, he had a family, of course. But, these people were educated to serve the country in the first place, not to think about their, their pay slip or their family or their children or their hobbies and such things. So all his life, he had to sacrifice for his company, in this case, Hitachi. He was a boiling engineer for boilers, big industrial boilers, so you can imagine how busy he was. It has also to do with Japanese overseas development aid, because at that time, and even today, foreign aid was related to Japanese contracts, government, it was government money which was given to developing countries, but it was Japanese companies who got the contracts to build these tunnels and bridges and railways abroad. So the money came back into Japanese pockets, you can say like this. So he worked in Japan, as I told you, but he worked also abroad because of this Japanese official development assistance. So a lot of Japan was, and is even today, I think, still one of the very most important ODA providers for developing countries. So much of the money was invested in Japan, but also a lot of money was invested in foreign countries to develop them. And this has, of course, to do also with the war, because of it was a kind of war reparation. So nowadays, Japan is even more active in Asia. But at that time, it was also because of the war, Japan felt like obliged to help those countries. So nowadays, countries ask for development help, but at that time, Japan just offered development aid to those countries. The most important being China. China received really very important amounts of development aid from Japan until 1970s, or even later, because China didn't want war reparations like some other countries, also Sri Lanka. So instead of war reparations, Japan offered very important official development assistance to those countries. So this is an important point which I wanted to make. So people sacrificed their life for Japan, and Japan had very impressive growth rates. I can show you a graph to show you the growth rates in Japan after the war. When you look at this chart, This is the GDP growth rate in Japan. This was unprecedented. This was no other country achieved such growth rates in such a short time. More than 10% year by year in a row, for almost 10 years in a row. Imagine such a growth rate. I think only China can compete nowadays, or China had similar growth rates in the past. So this is in Europe, it's impossible to have such growth rates. So until 1970s, until the first oil shock, Japan has very impressive growth rates. And Japan was called the factory of the world. It was like China today. It was the #1 manufacturing country. And all of the Japanese exports, all of the Japanese products were exported. You know, I can show you the data later, but Japan exported most of its goods and products globally, especially to Europe and America, to developed countries. And there was a joke, an anecdote that the Prime Minister of Japan, his job was not to make diplomacy or to make politics, but to sell Japanese transistor radios. So de Gaulle, when Ikeda visited France, de Gaulle said, he's a Japanese salesperson. He's trying to sell me a Japanese transistor radio. That was kind of joke, but that was the reality. That was like this. One of the factors, one of the reasons why Japan exported so much was, one reason was also the exchange rate. After the war, the exchange rate was fixed. So it was, of course, it was fixed and it was connected to the US dollar. And one US dollar was worth 371 yen. So we can say that the yen was very weak after the war. And also, this is also one of the reasons why Japan could export so many products all over the world. But as I told you, these products were made in Japan products. Let me show you quickly again, the slide, because here you see the picture of a man. I make it a little bit bigger. He's the chairman of Sony. And I think he symbolizes this success story, Japanese products being exported all over the world. That was the golden time of Japan until I would say until end of the 1980s, from 1945 to end of the 1980s, when Made in Japan was really a brand image. It was highly valued. I don't know if you know Sony products. Maybe you know the Sony Walkman, Sony TVs, the Aibo robot. They developed a robot. You know, they were leaders in electronics development, and you know, it was just unbeatable. Sony products were highly valued for their quality, but also for their price, which was competitive. And this Akio Morita, he was the brain behind Sony. And yes, this book has been written by him. If you have time, please read it. But these times are over. These times are over. Made in Japan and also exporting, these times are over. As you know, nowadays, made in Japan is not existing so much anymore. It's now made in China, as you know. Most products are now made by China and in China. So manufacturing has shifted from Japan to China, I would say. And Japan is still exporting a lot, but Japan is also investing a lot abroad. So In the 1980s, 70s, most factories were located in Japan, and you know, the workers were manufacturing in Japan. Nowadays, lots of Japanese production has been outsourced to Asian countries, but also to Europe, to US, because of the globalization of our economy. Japan has also been investing a lot abroad, foreign direct investments everywhere globally. So this is certainly a shift of the Japanese economy, which has been very big, I would say. It's difficult to find, I mean, there are still the Japanese manufacturers, like there's the car industry in Japan still, of course. Cars are still made in Japan, but not so much. Maybe some components, but not the whole car. Usually, some components are made in Japan and then it's assembled maybe in foreign countries because for several reasons. Japan has right now a labor shortage, and this is a big disadvantage. Japan has no immigrants. Of course, Japan has immigrants, but not enough to cover the labor shortage. The exchange rate, of course, has also changed. The yen is much stronger than it used to be, but I think it's not the major reason. I think it's just a natural development of globalization, that you have to be present everywhere and you have to be competitive everywhere. One reason why Japan is also a little bit less competitive is because also the wages in Japan have not really risen. They have been quite. The real wages have not increased in Japan. So you know, Japanese people, they don't ask for pay increases. They don't strike like they do in other countries. This has to do also again with their work ethics, which is very important to understand. So this is also an important reason why you know, Japan has the problems it has now with consumption tax, but also with low consumption, deflation, and all these problems. But let me go back to the 1980s, when Japan was at its peak of exporting, but also technological level. Made in Japan was a highly valued product globally, and it was cheap. It was a very good maintenance, and you could buy it everywhere. But then came something happened. It is called deflation, which really shook Japan. You know, I spoke about this book written by Akio Morita. That was really the peak of Japanese success or economic development. After this, things went in the opposite direction. Why? So we call it the age of deflation. It has to do with the oil shock. It has to do also with Japan bashing. I remember pictures on American TV when American workers were smashing Japanese cars because they thought that Japanese products, you know, were, you know, underpriced. It was a kind of, you know, a Japanese strategy to invade America with Japanese products. So American workers smash Japanese cars in public now. It's a little bit like Trump, you know, buy American again. So becoming isolated and just looking at your own economy and trying to, or thinking, imagining that, you know, America is cut off from the world, which is not the case. There are many things which we cannot influence, which is just the global trade, and it's the global competition which we have to face and which we cannot stop. So Japanese American workers were thinking Japan was unfair and, you know, just overflowing their market with cheap Japanese cars, and they smashed them. So that was the peak of Japanese exports to the world. After this, the deflation period happened, or we call it also the bubble economy. What is the bubble economy? Maybe you have heard about this. Now, it also happened in the United States, the so-called Lehman, when the Lehman Brothers collapsed. So basically, this has to do with an overheating of the real estate market. So what happens is that, as you know, maybe in Japan, the most important thing or the most important good you have is of course cash. Is the money you have in your pockets, it's your savings, it's your investments, but it's your stock, but the most important in Japan is the soil or the land you have. Why is that so? Because Japan is a very narrow, small country, small island, where you don't have enough space to build houses and condominiums. So land is very highly valued. If you have land, it's even more worth than money or gold or diamonds or anything. If you have land, you are on the winner side. If you have land in Ginza, which is a posh district of Tokyo, then your life is made forever. Right now, the prices in Japan for condominiums, 100 square meters, is more than 100 million yen. I don't know in Armenian money or how much this is, but it's 100 million yen for a 1 or 80 square meter condominium apartment in a high-rise building in Tokyo. So you see the prices. At that time, when the deflation happened, so what happened? In simple terms, banks were lending money and they were getting collaterals. So they were asking for some guarantees. I lend you money, but you have to give me something so that I can be sure that you pay back your money to me. So they were taking land as collateral. And then they were giving money not to private people, but to other companies. In Japan, as you know, maybe you don't know, but companies, it's much easier for companies to borrow money and and they have very strong business connections with banks. We call this a Keiretsu system. So there's cross shareholding between the banks and the companies. They own each other. So it's very intransparent and it's not very capitalistic. It's very Japanese style business ethics. So at that time, banks were lending money to companies. Companies were giving them collaterals and land plots. So the prices, everything was good as long as the prices of the land increased. And the land prices increased dramatically. That means that banks lent even more money because everyone was in a frenzy. Everyone was upbeat. You know, this is a lot about psychology. It's not about economy. It's not, you don't have the cool mind. You become, everybody becomes like, how can I say, becomes like psychologically very upbeat. And so everybody thinks it's going to become better, even better. So at that time, you know, also the stock market increased because, yes, more and more shares were sold on the market. Japanese companies sold their shares because, of course, because they could get more money and they could, you know, buy and sell more shares, and you know, everyone was upbeat. And then the share price also went up dramatically. the Nikkei index, which is a stock exchange in Tokyo, the Nikkei index, which collects the share prices of the most important companies in Japan, it went up to 40,000. The Nikkei index has never been above 20,000. So it almost doubled in a few years to 40,000. This was not reflecting the real state of the economy. That was the problem. So what happens with a bubble? What happens with an overheating of economy? The central bank also tried to control this by lowering the interest rates, but monetary policy, fiscal policy, the government was trying to intervene too by spending money, investing, public works, and so on. So both the government and the Central Bank of Japan were out of control. So what happened is that the bubble just exploded because there was no real basis. It was just speculation. Everyone speculated. Like with the Lehman shock, when Lehman Brothers collapsed, it was the same situation. In America, it was the same situation with the mortgages of houses. So the companies who had borrowed money couldn't pay back. The land that the banks had was not worth anything. So everything collapsed. The GDP went from 10% to maybe 0 or even negative. So Japan lost everything in a few years. So this is something which is very difficult to understand. How could this happen? And why is it still ongoing? So nowadays, Japan is not suffering anymore from deflation, but there are still major issues in Japanese economy, which are not under control. So one is that I told you already that the wages haven't been increasing in Japan. The real wages haven't been increasing in Japan for 15 years or 20 years. That is one issue. The other issue is that is deflation. So you have very low demand, very low consumption, and then you have also, in Japan, you have low investments, you have bankruptcies increasing, so companies not hiring. And one thing which I didn't mention, one big change in Japanese labor force is that you have more and more irregular workers in Japan. In the 1980s, 90s, the typical Japanese office worker, he was employed for life, and the company cared for everything for him. I remember we went to my father-in-law's, they had like houses at the beach everywhere in Japan where the workers could recover. Of course, they never went there because they never had time to go there. But when my father-in-law was 60 or so, just before retirement, we could go there and he had more time. So such places, the big companies, they have this kind of, vacant summer houses where the employees can, in principle, recover and take a rest with their family. I say in principle because they work so much. Overtime is so high. So in Japan, it's very difficult to, the paid holidays in Japan are like 2 weeks paid holidays, but actually in reality, most workers don't take paid holidays. They only take holidays when they really must, like somebody has died or the school entrance for their child. So they take off, maybe in reality, they take off only 2 or 3 days a year or 4 days now. In Western Europe, our paid holiday is 6 weeks, and in Japan is about 2 weeks now. On paper, it's 2 weeks, but it's much less in reality. So you have more and more irregular workers in Japan. This is also a result of deflation and of the, the problems Japan has faced in the past. So before deflation, the bubble economy happened, Japan had, I don't know, but Japan had a very high percentage of full-time employees. So that means you get your salary 12 months and you get your summer bonus and winter bonus up to 6 months. So you get a total salary of 18 months. Of course, the basic salary is not like in Europe or in America. The basic salary is quite low, but still it can be a big, it can make a big difference for full-time employees. If you get 6 months annual bonus, you can buy the things you need. For example, a TV, a car, or you can make some trip, or you can buy, you can spend some money for your school kit, for the tuition fees, and so on. So depending on the economic performance of the company, people can get up to 18 months of salary. Full-time employee. Full-time employees also have other benefits, like they get paid the commuting cost. They can stay in a employee dormitory, and they get also, when they die, they get some insurance money paid out by the company. The company even, will organize their funeral. They will organize their wedding, everything. That was in 1980s, 90s. Nowadays, this is not the case anymore because, sorry, I don't know the actual percentage, but I think a growing number of employees in Japan is irregular workers. So that means they are not fully employed. They get paid by the hour, or they get a part-time, they have a part-time job, they get paid by the month, but then the amount is very low. They get only paid for the actually worked hours. They don't get a bonus, they don't get a salary increase. All these things they don't get. In the worst case, the drivers here, the Amazon drivers, the Uber drivers, they are paid by the piece of luggage they deliver. So it can be very, very cruel. Japan can be very, very cruel if you are not a full-time employee. Then life can be very hard in Japan. So all these things, negatively influence the situation in Japan. Also, I must also mention the consumption tax increases. So Japan had a consumption tax of, in the past, of 1%. Now it's 10%. Of course, the consumption tax in Europe is much higher. In Europe, it is 25%. But you must know that Japan has a different thinking towards consumption tax compared to Europe. In Japan, consumption tax was never regarded as an important source of income. It was rather the income tax and corporate taxes and other taxes. So it was quite a shock to Japanese people when the Japanese government increased the consumption tax. And this had also a very negative impact on the consumption and on the deflation and on the economic situation in Japan. So I want to show you another slide about the GDP to give you an idea how it developed in Japan over the years. I have one slide, sorry, I have to find it. One slide which I want to show you. I hope we have still time to, I will show it to you. I cannot talk about all the topics today, but it would take too much time. But this slide here, I'm not sure if you can see it. I make it a little bit smaller. You see here, it shows the nominal GDP, the real GDP, and then the GDP deflator. I'm sure you know what it is. And when you look here, the GDP was over zero. It was, it was the nominal GDP, even the real GDP, as I told you, was 10% or so. But when you look at after the bubble exploded, after the economy crashed in 1989, 1990, you see that the GDP deflator is going negative. Here a little bit up. That was when Abe came to power. Shinzo Abe, he was a Japanese prime minister who had his own economic package, which was called Abenomics. And then the economy grew a little bit, but went down again. It had no long-term impact. But if you look at this GDP deflator, you can see that the Japanese economy has been actually negative over the last, we can say 20, 30 years. So we have two completely different pictures. We have the high economic growth, Japanese economic miracle after the war until 1980s, end of 1980s, and then we have the collapse, the crash of the Japanese economy after 1990, and it even lasts until today. So you have two different pictures. Of course, we know we had also some important events here which really impacted this development. One was the earthquake in Kobe, which was in 1995, which has also, of course, if you have a disaster, you had it also in Armenia, I know, but if you have a disaster, it negatively impacts your economy as a whole. So we had one important disaster in 1994, the earthquake in Kobe. And then we had, of course, the Fukushima disaster, the nuclear disaster in 2011. You can also see that deflator goes here very much down, goes here a little bit up again, but it's also basically negative now. 1994 is zero negative, and here 2011 it's very negative, but going up a little bit again. So this gives you the real picture of the Japanese economy. It also tells us that it's very difficult nowadays if politicians tell you we want to increase the GDP, we want to, we want to have price stability, we want to increase labor employment, and all these things, all these promises. I think it's the same in Armenia. Politicians promise you all these things, but it's impossible to keep those promises. You know why? Because politicians think short term. It's the same in Japan than Armenia. Politicians want to win elections. So usually what they do is they do a fiscal expenses, fiscal investments, building new bridges, building new tunnels, building new museums, and something like that. So the money, short term, there will be some impact, but long term, it will not really change or improve the economy. I think that is something which we can learn from the Japanese example. So now Japan is very worried about the exchange rate, but if we talk about the exchange rate, the yen has been very weak recently, which is good for exports, and it's also good for foreigners who want to visit Japan. So if you want to visit Japan, now it's the time to come. The yen was very weak, so it was much cheaper for foreigners to come here. So that's why so many foreigners came, and that was good for the economy, of course. Sometimes the exchange rate can help, but in Japan, really, it hasn't really made a big impact, the exchange rate, I think. Now Japan is concerned about, making the yen a little bit stronger again, but I don't think it makes a big difference because the yen is quite good, is quite realistic. The exchange rate is quite realistic right now. As I told you before, after the war, it was politically fixed at 361 yen for $1, and now it's about 140. It has been 100. So when the yen is really strong, it was 100. Now it's 140. Maybe it's becoming a little weaker again. But I don't think it makes, in the long run, it will not change so much. So when Japanese politicians talk about all these things, they really think always short term. Now we have a new prime minister in Japan, Mr. Ishiba, and also the previous prime minister, Mr. Kishida. They were not really making a big impact on the economy. They were talking a lot, but they keep only in mind the short term, winning the election. So they are talking about price stability, about household incomes, about hiring, and but it doesn't really change. It hasn't changed. They haven't changed anything in Japan. It's just words, and this doesn't mean that all is bad in Japan. The Japanese economy has also many strengths. Let me show you a graph. Maybe we have to finish soon, but I also want to tell you about the future at the end. I couldn't talk about everything, but maybe you have questions. Please write down the questions and send them to me, and I will answer them if you have questions. Now I want to show you a little bit what the future will bring us. I give you some information. Okay, one development is manufacturing. Manufacturing in Japan is, of course, China is winning. On the winning side, Japan is on the losing side. But overall, manufacturing will decrease in the future. So it will not be manufacturing who will save Japan or China. So we don't worry about this. Overall, manufacturing as a share of the economy will decrease in the future. So this is not a big loss. A big problem is debt to GDP ratio. Japan has too many Japanese politicians issue too many Japanese government bonds. Government bonds, you have money, you can print money, you can issue bonds and collect money to invest into public works. But the problem is this is a future burden on future generations. It is a kind of future tax. So bonds, Japanese government bonds, it's a future tax. It's a future tax burden for the children who are not born yet. So this is a big problem. 234% of GDP is too much. Japan is #1 in OECD. So also Japan has a problem with tax revenue. Tax revenue is not really increasing as you see here. So what to do? That is a big problem. Another issue is increased military spending. In Japan, there are not enough tax revenue. There is not enough tax revenue to finance the military spending. So they are now issuing again government bonds, future taxes. They are cutting some budgets, such as social security budgets, and they try to increase taxes, which is not good because, as you know, tax increases always have a negative impact on consumer spending and consumer, motivation and consumer, it's not a good idea. So Japan has not enough tax resources, has too much spending, too much debt. These are some of the problems now. Education is also an issue. Japan spends not enough into education. Another issue is we have many issues with Japanese school children not going to school anymore, and also teachers being off the job because they have mental issues. Still, I checked here the data for Armenia, Japan, and Germany. Still, Japan is better than Armenia on public spending for education. So in terms of GDP, it's far below Germany, but okay, we cannot compare Armenia and Japan anyhow. But let's compare it with Germany. Then Japan is definitely weak. It could, if you want to offer a future to your children, you have to invest into education. There is no other way, especially the government. A government which invests more money in military than in education, there is a problem, I think. So this is another issue. ODA, Japanese Development Aid, has been, yes, has been increasing. Yes, but still, yes, it's 0.7% of the gross national product. So the target is among OECDs, I think 1%. So maybe this is not so bad. Japan is doing a lot. Japan is financing the United Nations. Japan is financing the International Criminal Court. Japan is financing the World Food Program and many other UN organizations. Japan is also financing the Palestinians in Gaza. So Japan is doing a lot to financially, and I think that's good. And we can thank Japan for this. Foreign direct investment, you see, it has been flat in percent of GDP has been flat, but now it's increasing, especially after 2000. So that shows us that the Japanese economy is much, oriented globally and, working towards, increasing their share in foreign countries, which is a good development, I think. Outward FDI, foreign direct investment by region, it's going more into Asia, I would say. Europe still a big part, but I think this data is not so new, so I think it's going more into Asia right now. So Japan was the second largest investor of FDI globally. That shows you the power and the strength of Japanese economy. Yes. So also, I think that's all. But Japan has also a huge trade surplus, trade account surplus. So Japan is on the global market, in the global markets and internationally, Japan is very competitive, has a good R&D, good products. When you look at the Japanese companies, the globally leading Japanese companies, they are very strong. Even in the space business, they are they are also investing in this area. SpaceX, a Japanese company. So Japan is very active, and Japanese economy has also very many strong points. Made in Japan is becoming popular again, Japanese companies are producing abroad, are exporting, and everything is going well. The problem is more inside Japan. Of course, you have the Japanese hospitality industry, the Japanese tourism industry, which is booming now. Japanese hotel industry is booming now. But this is maybe the only industry which is booming right now. The stock index, the Nikkei index, is also booming because of foreign investors investing in Japan. But when we look at other issues, we see that Japan has definitely some problems. As I told you before, many irregular workers, so mostly male people, men who cannot find a job. So that means they cannot have a family, they cannot marry, they cannot get children. This is a big problem in Japan. Childless society, too many old people in Japan compared to other countries. So that means huge social security costs in the future. This is also a big problem. No immigrants in Japan. So how do you want to replace? So the active labor population is also decreasing in Japan. So what do you want to do? Who should do the work? Robots? No, robots, they were thinking about this now, but robots cannot do everything. So either you have more children, or you have more old people working, or you have more immigrants now. So Japan definitely favors old people working. Maybe this is also the solution to the problem of having too many high social security costs, because if you have old people who are healthy and working, maybe that's good for the economy. It's also good for the keeping down social security costs. But I don't know if this is something which in Armenia you would do if you think about old people having worked all their life. And then I think they also merit to retire one day and enjoy, life with their grandchildren. So that would be my attitude. Another big problem is the small and medium companies in Japan. They are really the backbone of Japanese economy. So without them, Japan would never have been so successful. They are so competitive, they are so creative, and they work so hard. But they suffer most now under the current situation because they don't have enough labor force. Then a big problem which Japan also faces is the import cost for energy has grown dramatically. Japan imports all its energy, all its resources from abroad. So this has really hard hit the small and medium companies. They can also not raise the salaries, the wages. They cannot find labor force. The cost is too high. So these companies, as I told you before, one of the big problems in Japan is also the high number of bankruptcies. No? So they have no successor because the president is often 80 years old, 90 years old. They have no successor. They have no labor force. Too high cost. So it's an issue because without those companies, Japan will not survive. Japan cannot survive just with the Toyotas and Sonys. Japan also needs those small and medium enterprises and companies. Without them, Japan will not have a future. So I think I come to the end of my lecture. I said many things, and maybe, some things maybe you don't agree or you have more questions. So please, you can write questions to your teacher, and your teacher will give me those questions, and I will try to answer those questions as good as I can. Lastly, I would like to thank you for listening to me. I hope my English was not too difficult, and I hope to see you one day in Japan. So I think Japan it's not an easy country to live, and it's not easy to be successful in Japan. I had also a hard time working in Japan and being respected and the culture shock, but I think I made it, and I can give you some advice, about how can I be successful in Japan. Maybe I can give you some advice and some ideas or some inspiration also, if you need this, if you think about, exporting to Japan, opening a business in Japan. Yes, I know the situation in Armenia, and I know that Japan is much bigger market and has many opportunities, especially in the tourism sector right now, but also in other industries. Agriculture, Japan needs help and expertise. Fishing industry, Japan needs help and expertise. Also, like the third sector, like service industry, IT industry, Japan also needs expertise and help. So there are many opportunities in the Japanese market. And I'm sure that Armenia has much to offer, much know-how, and you are also very, very educated. So you have the right skill set to come to Japan, I think, Armenian people. Because, to be honest, Japanese people sometimes, if you come from one country, you are better regarded than if you happen to be born in another country. But this is the same in everywhere in the world. If you happen to have this skin color, or you come from this country, you are treated differently from someone else. So this is something which it happens everywhere globally. It's not just Japan. It's also, I'm sure it's also happening in Armenia and in other countries too. So this is something we have to overcome. These limitations and these stereotypes, also in economy, in business. I didn't talk about these things, but there's a very peculiar or very typical Japanese business culture, which you have to understand. But it's changing, of course. It's becoming more global and more international. Young Japanese people are more open to change. Old Japanese people, maybe they have more, they have a bigger love of their own country, they value their country more. Maybe younger people, they are less conservative. They are more open to change, but of course they know less the Japanese way and the Japanese etiquette. The old people, of course, know this much better. So you can gain from both old people and young Japanese people. You can get new insights and new ideas. Okay, thank you very much for listening to me today. I hope it was not too long, and hope to see you in Japan. Goodbye. Thank you.